Wedding portrait resurfaces after 100 years. And historians pale when they zoom in on the bride. The auction house in Charleston, South Carolina, was clearing out the Whitmore estate when Dr. James Miller noticed the photograph. Listed simply as wedding portrait, circa 1868, it sat among boxes of family papers and tarnished silver, its cracked glass and water-damaged frame suggesting decades of neglect. James, a historian specializing in Reconstruction-era photography, bid $30 for it, more from completeness than genuine interest. For 3 weeks, the photograph languished in his archive at the University of Georgia, scanned and cataloged alongside dozens of similar images. But while preparing a lecture on post-war Southern life, James finally examined it closely. He enlarged the image on his computer screen, studying the couple standing stiffly before a plantation house. The bride appeared young, perhaps 20, with delicate features and dark skin. She was black. The groom was white, significantly older, mid-50s, with a thick beard and cold eyes that stared directly at the camera. An interracial marriage in 1868 South Carolina would have been extraordinary, though not technically illegal in that brief window between war's end and Jim Crow's iron grip. James zoomed in on the bride's face. Her expression was eerily blank, showing none of the nervousness or joy typical in wedding portraits. Her eyes looked past the camera, unfocused, as if she existed somewhere else entirely. Then he noticed her hands. The bride wore white lace gloves, but something about their fit seemed wrong. James enhanced the image, sharpening the resolution, and his stomach dropped. At her wrists, where gloves met sleeves, were dark marks, scarring that formed distinctive patterns. He had seen such marks before in photographs of formerly enslaved people. They were shackle scars, left by iron restraints used on prisoners and enslaved individuals. But this was 1868. The Emancipation Proclamation had been issued in 1863. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ratified in December 1865. By 1868, slavery was illegal throughout the United States. So why did this bride have fresh shackle scars on her wrists? James leaned back, his mind racing. The scarring looked recent, the skin still darkened and raised, not the faded marks of old trauma. He studied the groom's cold expression, the plantation house looming behind them, the bride's empty stare. He examined her neck and found another mark, a line of scarring suggesting a collar had been worn there. This woman had been in bondage when this photograph was taken, 3 years after slavery was abolished. James reached for his phone with unsteady hands and called Dr. Angela Roberts, who specialized in African American history during Reconstruction at Howard University. "Angela," he said, his voice tight, "I need you to look at something. I think you're going to want to sit down first." Angela arrived in Charleston 2 days later, her research assistant Marcus in tow. James had sent high-resolution scans, but she insisted on seeing the original. They met in his university office, the photograph laid out under a magnifying lamp. Angela examined it in silence for several minutes, her expression darkening. "The shackle marks are unmistakable," she said finally. "And look here." She pointed to the bride's neck. "Another mark, a collar." "This woman was being held in bondage when this photograph was taken," Angela said, her voice tight with controlled anger. 3 years after slavery was abolished. Marcus, photographing the portrait from multiple angles, spoke up. "It happened more than people realize. After the war, some former slaveholders in remote areas simply didn't release the people they'd enslaved. They kept them isolated, threatened them, or used legal tricks, fraudulent apprenticeships, debt peonage, or forced marriages to maintain control." "A forced marriage," James said slowly. "That's what this is. He married her to make it look legitimate, to have legal paperwork, saying she was his wife, not his prisoner." Angela nodded grimly. Married women had almost no legal rights in that era. They were essentially property of their husbands. For a black woman married to a white man in the South during Reconstruction, with no family or community to protect her, she would have been completely trapped. "We need to find out who they were," Marcus said. "The photograph came from the Whitmore estate. Let's start there." James pulled up auction records. The estate belonged to Catherine Whitmore, who died at 93 last year. The family owned Whitmore Plantation in Beaufort County from before the Revolution until it was sold in 1932. "Beaufort County," Angela repeated. "Coastal, very isolated during Reconstruction. Federal troops concentrated in cities, Charleston, Columbia. Rural areas were largely left to their own devices." She turned back to the photograph. "This house? Can we identify it?" Marcus was already searching. "Here, Historical Registry of Plantation Houses in Beaufort County. Whitmore Plantation, main house built 1820, burned during Sherman's March, but rebuilt in 1866. He showed them a photograph from the early 1900s. The architecture matched perfectly. "So this photograph was taken at Whitmore Plantation," James said, "which means the groom was likely a Whitmore." Angela stood, her jaw set. "We're going to South Carolina. I want to see the plantation records, property deeds, anything that might tell us who this woman was and what happened to her." "Well, Marcus spoke quietly. What if we don't find a good ending? Angela looked back at the photograph, at the young woman's scarred wrists and empty eyes. Then at least we'll make sure someone finally tells the truth about what was done to her. She deserves that much. The South Carolina Historical Society archives in Charleston held the Whitmore family papers, decades of correspondence, ledgers, and property records. Angela, James, and Marcus spent 2 full days searching through boxes for anything from 1868. Plantation records were meticulous before the war, listing every enslaved person by name, age, and value. After 1865, records became sparse and vague. The 1866 ledger showed the plantation being rebuilt, with entries for laborers and workers, but no names. Marcus found the first real clue in personal correspondence. A letter dated March 1868 from Thomas Whitmore to his brother Robert in Atlanta. The situation here remains difficult. The freedmen are unreliable and leave without warning. I have taken measures to secure stable labor for the planting season. You need not worry about my household arrangements. Everything is legal and properly documented, though I expect some may question my choices. Let them question. A man must do what is necessary to preserve what is his. Secure, stable labor, Angela read aloud, her voice sharp. And properly documented. He's talking about the marriage. James found the next piece, a notation in the plantation ledger from June 1868. Marriage license obtained, Beaufort County Courthouse. Witnessed and recorded. They actually filed it legally, James said, disbelief in his voice. Of course he did, Angela replied bitterly. Make it legal so no one can accuse him of holding her against her will? Who's going to investigate a man's relationship with his own wife? Marcus was searching through another box. Here, a letter from a neighbor, dated August 1868, to Thomas Whitmore. Dear Thomas, I feel compelled to express my concerns regarding the young woman residing at your plantation. Several of my field hands have reported hearing distressing sounds, and there are rumors that cause me considerable unease. While I understand these are difficult times, I urge you to ensure that all your arrangements are truly voluntary and legal. We cannot afford to give the federal authorities any cause for intervention. Signed, Jonathan Hartley. Someone noticed, James said. Someone tried to say something. But not enough, Angela replied, reading Thomas Whitmore's response. Your concerns are noted but misplaced. My wife and I conduct our private affairs as we see fit. I suggest you attend to your own household and cease spreading malicious gossip. The word wife mocked them from the page. The Beaufort County Courthouse records from 1868 had been digitized. Marcus pulled them up, searching marriage licenses from June. There it was. Thomas Whitmore, age 51, planter. To Sarah, age 19, Negro, spinster. No last name given for the bride. Just Sarah. No surname, no family listed, no history, Angela said quietly. Just a first name, as if she appeared from nowhere. But now they had something to search for. Marcus began searching through Freedmen's Bureau records, the federal agency established to help formerly enslaved people transition to freedom. If Sarah had been enslaved at Whitmore Plantation before the war, there might be records. 2 hours later, he found it. A registry from 1865, listing people emancipated from Whitmore Plantation. Sarah, female, approximately 16 years old, house servant. Angela felt a chill. Sarah had been enslaved at Whitmore. She had been freed in 1865, and 3 years later she was back there, married to her former enslaver, wearing shackles under her wedding dress. The Freedmen's Bureau records painted a clearer picture. In January 1866, Sarah appeared on a registry in Charleston, living in a freedmen's settlement and working as a laundress. The record noted she could read and write, unusual for someone who had been enslaved. By April 1866, there was another entry. Sarah, formerly of Whitmore Plantation, seeking assistance to locate family. Mother, Dinah, sold to Georgia, 1859. Father, unknown. Siblings, Brother James, last known location, Mississippi. She had been trying to reunify with her family, like thousands of other newly freed people. Then the record stopped. No more entries for Sarah after April 1866 until the marriage license in June 1868. 2 years of silence. Angela contacted colleagues who specialized in Reconstruction violence and labor coercion. The stories were horrifying, but not surprising. Former slaveholders used various methods to force black people back into servitude: fraudulent debt contracts, false arrest and convict leasing, kidnapping, and outright violence. Isolated young women were particularly vulnerable, explained Dr. Patricia Henderson at Duke University. If they had no family nearby, no community protection, they could simply disappear. Some were told they owed debts for their childhood upbringing. Others were grabbed off the streets and taken to remote plantations where no one could hear them. Angela shared the photograph with Patricia, who studied it carefully. The wedding dress is too fine for what a freed woman could afford, but not elaborate. This looks like a dress made specifically for this photograph. He wanted documentation that looked respectable. James had been researching Thomas Whitmore. The man had been 48 when the war ended, unmarried, bitter about the Confederacy's defeat. His father and 2 brothers had died in the war. The plantation was his entire world. "I found his probate records," James said. "He died in 1891, age 74. In his will, he left a small parcel of land and $500 to my faithful wife, Sarah, should she survive me." "Did she survive him?" Marcus asked. James shook his head. "There's a notation. Wife deceased 1873. That's all. No details about her death, no burial location." Sarah had died at approximately 24 years old. 5 years. She had survived only 5 years of that forced marriage. Marcus found a newspaper article from the Beaufort Republican, dated March 1873. Tragic death at Whitmore Plantation. Mrs. Sarah Whitmore, wife of prominent planter Thomas Whitmore, died suddenly on Tuesday last. The cause of death is reported as fever. Mrs. Whitmore was known to be of delicate constitution. She is survived by her husband. Funeral services will be private. "Fever," Angela said flatly. "How convenient." "There's no death certificate on file," James added. "Either it was never filed or it's been lost." They sat in silence, looking at Sarah in her wedding dress, her wrists scarred, her eyes empty. A young woman who had survived slavery, tasted freedom, tried to find her family, and was dragged back into captivity through a legal document that called itself a marriage. "Someone else must have known," Marcus said. "That letter from the neighbor, Hartley. He suspected something. Were there other letters? Other people who noticed?" Angela searched through remaining Whitmore correspondence. In a bundle from 1870, she found something that made her pause. A letter from Elizabeth Hayes, addressed to Thomas Whitmore. "Sir, I am writing on behalf of the Ladies' Aid Society. We have heard distressing reports about the condition of your wife. Christian charity compels me to request that you allow our society to visit your home and ensure Mrs. Whitmore's well-being." Thomas Whitmore's response was curt. "Madam, your interference in my private affairs is neither welcome nor warranted. My wife is well cared for and has no need of your society's intrusions." Someone had tried. Someone had known something was wrong and attempted to intervene. But Thomas Whitmore had shut them out, and Sarah remained trapped. "We need to find the Ladies' Aid Society records," Angela said. "If they noticed enough to write to him, they might have documented more." The records of the Beaufort Ladies' Aid Society were stored in the town's historical museum. The society had been formed in 1866 by Northern women who came south during Reconstruction to help establish schools and provide aid to freed people. The society's secretary had been meticulous. Every meeting was recorded, every charitable visit documented. Angela found the first mention of Sarah in minutes from January 1870. Mrs. Elizabeth Hayes reported on a matter of concern. She has received information from a Negro servant regarding a young colored woman married to a white planter who may be in distress. The next mention came in March 1870. Mrs. Hayes reported that Mr. Whitmore declined our offer of assistance. The matter was tabled. Then, in June 1870, an entry that made Angela's hands tremble. A Negro woman named Dinah, seeking her daughter Sarah, came to our office. She had recently arrived from Georgia, and through the Freedmen's Bureau, located information that her daughter might be in Beaufort County. Sarah's mother. She had found her daughter. She had come looking for her. Marcus was already searching ahead through the Ladies' Aid Society records. Here, July 1870. Mrs. Hayes reports that Dinah, the Negro woman seeking her daughter, was turned away from Whitmore Plantation by Mr. Whitmore himself. She was told that his wife desired no contact with her former life, and that Dinah should not return. Dinah came to our office in great distress, insisting her daughter would never refuse to see her. "He wouldn't let her mother see her," James said, his voice hollow. "Her mother came all the way from Georgia, and he wouldn't even let them speak." Angela kept reading. The entries continued through 1870 and into 1871, documenting the Society's increasingly desperate attempts to help. They tried contacting the Freedmen's Bureau, but were told Sarah was legally married, and the Bureau had no authority over marital matters. They tried the local sheriff, who laughed and said a man's wife was his own business. They attempted to have a minister visit, but Thomas Whitmore refused. Dinah appeared repeatedly in the records, staying in Beaufort, taking whatever work she could find, hoping for a chance to see her daughter. In October 1871, she convinced a delivery man who brought supplies to the plantation to carry a letter to Sarah. The man reported that Mr. Whitmore intercepted all mail. In December 1871, Dinah tried to approach the plantation at night. She was caught by men Thomas Whitmore employed, beaten, and threatened with arrest if she trespassed again. The last mention of Dinah was March 1872. Dinah has left Beaufort, destination unknown. She came to our office before departing and expressed her belief that her daughter is being held against her will, but she has no means to help and fears for her own safety. She wept and said she had survived slavery only to lose her daughter to something worse. Angela closed the record book, Unable to continue, Sarah had been trapped. Her mother had been right there, so close, and Thomas Whitmore had kept them apart until Dinah was finally forced to give up and leave. Oh, what about 1873? Marcus asked quietly. The year Sarah died? Angela opened the next volume. In March 1873, there was a brief entry. News reached us of the death of Mrs. Sarah Whitmore. Mrs. Hayes expressed deep sorrow and stated that she believes the young woman's death may not have been from natural causes. However, as no autopsy was performed, and Mr. Whitmore has made the funeral private, there is no means to investigate. We have failed this young woman. That was all. Sarah had died, and even the women who had tried to help her could do nothing but record their sorrow. We need to find out if Dinah ever learned what happened to her daughter, Angela said, and we need to find where Sarah was buried. Tracking Dinah proved challenging. Marcus started with a Freedmen's Bureau registry from June 1870. The entry listed her as Dinah, approximately 43 years old, formerly enslaved in Georgia, literate, seeking family. The registry noted where she had come from. Emancipated from Thornton Plantation, Wilkes County, Georgia, 1865. James contacted colleagues at the University of Georgia. Within 2 days, they had found Dinah in the Thornton Plantation slave schedules from 1860. Dinah, female, age 33, house servant. One child, Sarah, age 7. The schedule also included a chilling notation. Child Sarah sold to South Carolina buyer, 1859. Sarah had been 6 years old when she was sold away from her mother. Census records showed Dinah's path after she left Beaufort in 1872. She appeared in the 1880 census in Atlanta, working as a laundress, living in a boarding house with other black women. By 1900, she was in Birmingham, Alabama, listed as a widow and working as a cook, living with a family named Johnson. The 1910 census showed Dinah, now listing her age as 83, still in Birmingham, still working despite her age. She was living with a younger woman named Mary Johnson and Mary's children. Dinah died in 1914, according to a death certificate Marcus located through Alabama Vital Records. She was buried in Birmingham's Elmwood Cemetery, in the section designated for black burials. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia. She was approximately 87 years old. She lived 41 years after Sarah died, James said quietly. She must have carried that grief for 4 decades. Angela made arrangements to travel to Birmingham. If Dinah had lived with the Johnson family, there might be descendants who knew her story. It took 3 weeks, but Marcus finally located a great-granddaughter of Mary Johnson, a woman named Patricia Collins, who lived in Atlanta and was active in genealogy circles, researching her family's history. When Angela called and explained what they had discovered, Patricia was silent for a long moment. My grandmother told me about Dinah, Patricia said finally. She lived with our family for years, helped raise my great-grandmother Mary. Grandma said Dinah was the kindest woman she'd ever known, but there was always a sadness in her. She used to talk about a daughter who had been taken from her during slavery, a daughter she'd tried to find after the war but couldn't save. Did she ever tell you her daughter's name? Angela asked. Sarah, Patricia said. Her name was Sarah. Dinah said she'd found her, but by the time she did, it was too late. She said her daughter had been trapped by a white man who claimed to be her husband, and that he'd killed her eventually, though no one would call it what it was. Grandma said Dinah cried every year on what she thought was Sarah's birthday. Angela felt tears burning in her eyes. We found a photograph of Sarah on her wedding day. We can see the shackle marks on her wrists. Patricia's breath caught. You found proof? Yes, and we're going to tell her story. We're going to make sure people know what was done to her and that her mother spent years trying to save her. Can you send me the photograph? Patricia asked. I'd like to see her. Dinah kept one thing with her always, a small piece of cloth she said Sarah had embroidered when she was little, before she was sold. It's all she had left of her daughter. I have it now. I'd like to finally see Sarah's face. Angela promised to send the photograph. But first, they needed to find one more thing, where Sarah was buried. Finding burial records from 1873 in rural South Carolina proved nearly impossible. Church records were incomplete, and many plantation owners buried black workers in unmarked graves on their own property, keeping no official documentation. Thomas Whitmore's probate records mentioned no family cemetery, and local church records showed no burial for Sarah Whitmore in March 1873. The Ladies' Aid Society records finally provided a clue. In April 1873, a month after Sarah's death, there was an entry. Mrs. Hayes reports that she spoke with the Negro man Jacob, who works at Whitmore Plantation. He stated that Mrs. Sarah Whitmore was buried in the old slave cemetery on the north edge of the property, not in the family plot. He expressed that this was wrong and shameful, but he had no power to change it. He buried her in the slave cemetery, Marcus said, anger in his voice. Even in death, he wouldn't acknowledge her as his wife. The old Whitmore plantation property had changed hands multiple times since 1932. The main house had burned in the 1950s, and the land had been subdivided. Part was now a housing development, part was farmland, and a section had been preserved as a nature preserve. James contacted the County Historical Preservation Office. A young woman named Courtney worked in land records and was immediately interested. There are several old burial grounds scattered across what used to be plantation properties, she explained. Many are overgrown and forgotten, but we've been working on documenting and protecting them. Let me see if I can locate where the Whitmore Slave Cemetery would have been. It took 2 days of comparing old property maps with modern surveys, but Courtney finally identified the location, a half-acre plot on what was now part of the nature preserve near a creek surrounded by live oak trees. No one's maintained it in decades, Courtney said. It's probably completely overgrown, but if you want to visit, I can arrange access. Angela, James, and Marcus drove out to the preserve on a humid morning in May. Courtney met them at the entrance and led them down an overgrown trail. The cemetery was exactly as she had described, completely overgrown, the ground covered with decades of fallen leaves and tangled undergrowth. There were no visible headstones, though several low mounds suggested grave sites. Live oaks formed a canopy overhead, their branches draped with Spanish moss. Most of these graves are unmarked, Courtney said quietly. Enslaved people and their descendants were rarely given proper markers. We know this is a cemetery because it shows up on maps, but we don't know who's buried where. Angela knelt, brushing away leaves from one of the mounds. There was nothing, no stone, no marker, no indication of who lay beneath the earth. Sarah's here somewhere, she said, along with who knows how many others. They spent an hour documenting the site, photographing it, marking the location with GPS. As they prepared to leave, Angela noticed a single oak sapling growing from one of the grave mounds, its leaves bright green in filtered sunlight. Life continuing, she said softly. Back in Charleston, they compiled everything they had learned. The photograph of Sarah in her wedding dress, the scars on her wrists, the marriage license that had legalized her captivity, the records of her mother's desperate attempts to save her, the testimony of the Ladies' Aid Society, and the location of her unmarked grave. Angela suggested what they should do next. We need to tell this story publicly, not just in academic journals where only other historians will see it. We need to write this for everyone, for Patricia and her family who carry Dinah's memory, for the descendants of everyone buried in that forgotten cemetery, for anyone who needs to understand that slavery didn't end cleanly in 1865. James nodded. And we need to do something about that cemetery. Get it properly marked and maintained. Make sure people know what happened there. Marcus was already drafting a press release. The photograph is going to shock people. That's good. They need to be shocked. They need to see Sarah's face and her scarred wrists and understand what was done to her under the cover of legality. They worked through the night, preparing an article for publication, reaching out to journalists, contacting descendants, planning a memorial service at the cemetery. The article appeared first in the Journal of Southern History, with a companion piece in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. The headline was stark. Wedding photo reveals illegal enslavement after abolition. Historian uncovers forced marriage used to hide captivity. The photograph of Sarah accompanied both articles, her young face, her empty eyes, and a close-up showing the shackle scars on her wrists. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story was picked up by national news outlets, shared thousands of times on social media, and sparked intense discussions about the violence of Reconstruction and the long shadow of slavery. Patricia Collins, Dinah's descendant, gave interviews about her great-great-grandmother's lifelong grief. She shared the piece of embroidered cloth that Dinah had kept, a small square of faded fabric with careful stitches forming a simple flower pattern made by Sarah's hands when she was a child. This was all Dinah had of her daughter, Patricia told reporters, holding the fragile cloth carefully. She carried it with her for nearly 50 years, and now finally people will know why. The Beaufort County Historical Society announced plans to establish a memorial at the old slave cemetery where Sarah was buried. Donations poured in from across the country, money to clear the overgrown site, install markers, and create an information board telling the stories of those buried there. Legal scholars wrote about how forced marriage had been used as a tool of continuing exploitation. Historians found other similar cases, at least a dozen documented instances of formerly enslaved women forced into marriages with their former enslavers in the years immediately after abolition. Sarah's story was no longer hidden. It was being told, being taught, being remembered. 6 months later, on a clear October morning, more than 200 people gathered at the restored cemetery on what had been Whitmore Plantation. The overgrown site had been cleared, the graves marked with simple stones, and a memorial wall erected listing the names of those known to be buried there. At the center stood a larger monument dedicated specifically to Sarah. It bore her photograph, not the wedding portrait, but the only other image Patricia had been able to find, a small daguerreotype showing Sarah as a young girl, smiling. Beneath it, an inscription read, Sarah, born approximately 1848, died 1873. Daughter of Dinah, survived slavery, sought freedom, was stolen back into bondage through forced marriage. Her mother never stopped searching for her. May her story remind us that justice delayed is justice denied. Angela stood before the crowd, holding the wedding photograph. This image almost disappeared into obscurity, she said. It survived by chance, stored in an attic, sold at auction, nearly overlooked. But Sarah's story deserves to be told, not just for historical record, but because it reveals a truth we must face. The violence of slavery did not end with emancipation. It continued in different forms, hidden behind legal documents and respectable facades. Patricia stood beside her, holding the piece of embroidered cloth. My great-great-grandmother Dinah carried this for nearly 50 years. It was all she had of her daughter, all she could hold on to. She died, never knowing if anyone would remember Sarah, if anyone would care what happened to her. She looked out at the crowd, tears streaming down her face. But we're here today. We remember. We care. And we're telling the truth. James spoke about the research process, about how one photograph had led to boxes of documents, to hidden stories, to a network of women who had tried to help Sarah and failed. The Ladies' Aid Society tried. Dinah tried. Neighbors suspected and some spoke up. But the law protected Thomas Whitmore. The law said Sarah was his wife, and what happened between husband and wife was private. The law was wrong. Old Marcus read from the Ladies' Aid Society records, from Dinah's pleas, from the letters of concern that went unanswered. Each word was a testament to Sarah's humanity, to her mother's love, to the injustice that had stolen her life. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence, followed by the planting of a young oak tree beside Sarah's memorial stone, life growing from grief, memory taking root. As people dispersed, many paused at the memorial wall, reading names, touching stones, standing in quiet reflection. Some left flowers, others left notes, messages to those buried there, promises to remember. Angela watched Patricia kneel beside Sarah's stone, placing the embroidered cloth at its base. It would be preserved later, protected under glass, but for this moment it lay on the earth, connecting mother and daughter across a century and a half. Do you think it's enough? James asked quietly, standing beside Angela. Telling her story, building this memorial, is it enough? Angela was silent for a moment, watching sunlight filter through the oak trees, illuminating the stones. It's not enough to erase what was done to her. Nothing could be, but it's something. It's the truth, finally told. It's Sarah being seen as a person, not property. It's Dinah's grief being honored. It's a record that will outlast us all. She looked at the wedding photograph in her hands, at Sarah's scarred wrists and empty eyes. And maybe it helps ensure that we don't forget how easily injustice can hide behind legality, how important it is to question what we're told is lawful and right. Marcus joined them, his camera in hand. He had documented the entire ceremony, capturing faces, moments, the memorial itself. This will be archived, he said. Students will learn about Sarah. Her story will be taught. That photograph that almost disappeared, it's going to educate people for generations. The three historians stood together looking at the memorial they had helped create. It had started with a photograph noticed by chance, a detail that made them look closer. It had led to months of research, painful discoveries, and ultimately to this, a place of remembrance, a story told, a life acknowledged. Patricia approached them, her eyes red, but her expression peaceful. Thank you, she said simply, for seeing her, for caring enough to find the truth, for giving Dinah's grief a voice even after all these years. Thank you for sharing her story with us, Angela replied, for trusting us with it. As they walked back toward the parking area, Angela looked back one last time at the cemetery. The memorial stone stood strong, Sarah's young face smiling from the daguerreotype, surrounded by flowers and notes and the promise that she would not be forgotten. The wedding photograph had revealed a terrible truth. But in revealing it, it had also restored something precious. Sarah's humanity, her history, her rightful place in the story of America's long struggle toward justice. She had been invisible in life, trapped and silenced. But in death, finally she was seen. She was heard. She was remembered. And that, Angela thought, was the least they could do. The very least, and perhaps the most important thing of all.